So, hello everybody again to this third transnational seminar that today is in person, but we have also some connected online. So we are in Faenza, and this is the last of the series of transnational seminar that will especially focus on network-based solution implementation and planning. So today, the seminar is Challenges and Opportunities for Network-Based Solution Planning and Implementation. I just want to show you the agenda of the speeches. Okay, we have short introduction to what we are going to address today during the seminar. Then we have the first presentation by me, focus on the policy instruments that can be used to promote network-based solution in urban adaptation planning, especially. Then we have another invited speakers. There's a typo, it's not from the municipality of Padua, of course, it's from the University of Venice as well. Linda Zardo, planning implication for network-based solution. So the focus of this second speech is on what some kind of important planning implication that we can have when talking about network-based solution implementation in cities. Then we will have a final wrap-up and discussion session to try to derive the lessons learned from these two speeches. Then we have a very short session, concluding session, final notes on our transnational seminar series and the materials that are provided together with these transnational seminars. Okay, so let's start with the first presentation by me. I'm going to close the agenda and again to share the screen with my presentation. Okay, can you see? Maybe. Okay, perfect. Okay, so today we're going to speak about different typologies of policy instruments that can be used to promote network-based solutions. So we are seeing network-based solution from the, say, planning perspective and implementation perspective. So how urban plans or urban policies, but not only urban, also all other kind of instruments that have a spatial dimension, how they can foster the implementation of network-based solution. So just a brief introduction about what we mean with policy instruments in planning. So we can define policy instrument in spatial urban planning practices as the instruments typically adopt to implement or directly implement or trying to promote the implementation of the action of a plan or of a policy. So generally speaking, let's say that a plan or a policy usually have some objectives, some action to reach the objectives, and then the policy instruments are the instrument adopted to try to implement these actions. So according to the general categorization that policy instrument may have, especially in the environmental policy domain, we can have three macro categories, three main macro categories. So the instruments that are, let's say, regulatory, instruments that are based on incentives, and then instruments that are based on sharing information. But what does it mean? So if we try to, let's say, to have a categorization, a more detailed categorization of the different typology of instruments, this categorization follow the so-called, let's say, degree of cohesiveness. So we know that, for example, regulatory instruments are the ones that usually set legally binding requirements, so are more coercive while when we talk about incentive-based instruments, we are talking about more voluntary instruments, as well as information-based instruments are not legally binding too. So if we define the different typology of instruments that we can have under these three macro categories, especially in the spatial and urban planning field, we may, let's say, divide we may derive 5 main typologies. So regulation, design-based tool, and land acquisition programs, that all are under the umbrella of the regulatory instruments. Then we have incentive-based instruments that can be based on financial, but also on non-financial incentives. And then, of course, instruments that are based on or that are aimed on transferring tools and knowledge sharing, information, and so on. So instruments that are, let's say, more directed to raise the awareness of people. So these are, let's say, more concise definition of the three typology of instruments. So regulatory instruments can be defined as instruments that are usually legally binding, as we already said. And these instruments entail mandatory action through prescription or prohibition, that said in the environmental policy domain, to protect land from or to mitigate development impacts. So these are, let's say, the overall aim of the regulatory instrument. When we talk about incentives, so incentive-based instruments that we said are usually applied on a voluntary basis. So what means that the target groups are free to react or not, are free to accept if they want to do an action and receive an incentive or to do nothing. So it's a, let's say, voluntary action. And this action, let's say, the aim of this instrument is, of course, to encourage, to stimulate and promote or discourage and restrain certain activities. And these activities, of course, are, let's say, all the activities defined for enhancing the existing future environmental condition. Of course, they are voluntary, but when a target group, private developer, let's say an example, accept to receive an incentive, of course, then you have to make a legally binding agreement. So I do something and I receive something. So they are voluntary at the beginning, but when you, let's say, accept to do something, there is also a legal agreement then. Then the third category, information-based instruments, also knowledge-based or soft instruments, mostly focus on the transfer of knowledge and meaningful information. So just to raise awareness of people about some aspects. So we saw in this few slides what policy instrument in planning means and how they work. So we were not talking about directly network-based solutions so far, but the important thing is that policy instruments that exist for a number, let's say, and that cover a number of aspects, they can be tailored to promote the implementation of network-based solutions as well, of course. So if we ask what contribution can policy instrument provide to climate change adaptation, of course, the answer is that they can be used, they can be tailored, they can be, let's say, developed with a specific aim to promote the implementation and scaling up of network-based solutions that address these climate impacts and adaptation needs. So now, before seeing examples of how the instruments can be used for promoting network-based solution, I want to focus a little bit on the, let's say, term scaling up. So what we mean when we talk about network-based solution implementation and especially scaling up. If we search for some more or less, let's say, official or definition in the literature, scaling up means in let's say starting changes in laws, policies, or norms based on promising lower level management practices. In our case, these management practices are network-based solution. So how we manage a city, we already saw. So that there were much efforts, especially promoted by the European Union in all this kind of European funded project to show the evidence base that network-based solutions are a very good option in tackling climate change challenges. So we know that we have some promising, let's say, network-based approaches, but now we have to, let's say, start enlarging the scopes of some from pilot project to everyday practices. So this means scaling up. So we have to change the behaviors of people, stimulating them by regulation, incentives to adopt more network-based approaches. And this is especially important because when we use spatial planning policy instruments to make network-based project from pilot project to everyday practices, we enable MBS uptake in cities or in territories in general, and they're scaling out. So we pass, let's say, from the scaling up, and then we enable the scaling out, meaning that scaling out means geographically replicating from highly localized solution to wider application. So large-scale implementation of network-based solution. So all this to say that this is, from the planning perspective at least, the only way to reach, let's say, those cumulative benefits of the scale-up network-based solution that to make a real effect, a real tangible effect in addressing urban climate challenges. So just to make an example, of course, we start from a smaller project. We can, let's say, redefine an urban square more green, planting trees, but to have a real reduction on the urban Italian effect, it's not that square reduce the urban Italian effect in all the city. While if we enable this scaling out, widespread, let's say, application, we really have then an effect at the city scale. So this is one of the main objectives of, let's say, from the planning perspective for network-based solution. We set the basis or which condition we can operate in planning a network-based solution. So what is, let's say, the added value of using different policy instruments to enable network-based solutions scaling up and scaling out. So, but now in practice, because this was all from the theoretical level, but now in practice, let's see what instruments can be used and for what network-based solution they can be used. So this is part of a research that will review real-world case study application of policy instrument application, especially to specifically promote network-based solution, to find evidence of use and what type of instruments are typically adopted in urban spatial plans worldwide to promote network-based solution. We found, let's say, we found six typologies, six subcategories of specific instruments that can be, let's say, categorized as regulations. We have the design-build tools and acquisition programs that work as an overall instrument itself, an overall type of instrument itself. Then we found 7 typologies of incentive-based instrument and 3 main typologies of information-based instrument. Now we are going to see one by one which type of instrument we are talking about as some examples of their application to promote more nature-based approaches. So we start from the regulation. So the 6 typologies of regulation that we found are the following. So the first one concerns let's say, definition of quantitative targets or standards that must be met when in the process of developing an area or redeveloping it. So let's say at a project, when a new project is established. So one of, let's say, the examples that we found on this is that, for example, the city of Toronto, the municipality of Toronto, in their urban planning codes and plans, prescribe a minimum volume of stormwater to retain and manage into the private property in order that we reduce, let's say, the stormwater that reach the sewage systems. So we reduce the pressure on the sewage system when it rains a lot. This is to mitigate flood risk, and this is especially achieved by installing nature-based solution that collect and infiltrate water into the ground in the property. So like we saw also in the last seminar, to manage stormwater locally, not allowing the stormwater reaching the sewage system of the city. This, of course, contributes, if, let's say, implemented in large scale, this contributes to reducing pressures on the sewage system and reducing the flood risk, sewage overflow during extreme events. Another type of instrument among the regulation is the definition of specific elements or specific technologies that must be included when developing an area. So, for example, in many cities worldwide, for example, Berlin and Portland, so there are a lot of European and North American cities especially that use this type of regulation, impose the installation, for example, of green roofs or of permeable pavements or of sustainable urban drainage system. So each, let's say, project, each developer that want to develop an area to, let's say, obtain the building permit have to install this kind of nature-based solution along with the development of the buildings and the other amenities. Then we have the typology of compensation measures. So this is another regulation that define mandatory ecological compensation action that must be realized when developing an area. This, let's say, can be defined at the municipality level, but also can be promoted by supraordinate regulation. For example, in Germany, there is some federal regulation requiring all municipalities to have into their building codes and building regulation the compensation rule, so the compensation requirement. So compensation when developing an area, you have to compensate your impact. For example, installing some nature-based solution on site, so within the project area, so a green roof in the buildings that you are going to build, but also can be compensation off-site. For example, for some reason I cannot install nature-based solution in my project, but I compensate my impact by planting trees along the street that pass nearby my project area or in a park area. So I contribute, let's say, to compensate my impact elsewhere. Then we have more articulated, let's say, regulation that is the so-called performance-based approaches with point systems. Probably you cannot see the figure very well, but how it works? It works that within these performance-based approaches, there is a definition of a minimum performance score that must be gained by the project. And these scores are, let's say, achieved by introducing nature-based solution into the project. So there is a minimum score. Each different typology of nature-based solution have, let's say, a weight, a score itself. So for example, if the city said that in that area for my project, I have to reach a score of 2, and the scoring sheet said, okay, if you put a green roof, it's 0.5. If you put a rain garden, it's another 0.5. If you plant 10 trees, it's 1 point. So if I put in my project area a green roof, a rain garden, and I plant some trees, I reach the minimum score, so I can be granted with the development permit. So it's a different way to force the developers integrating nature-based solution in their project. Okay, another type of regulation, more simple one, is just saying that an area has to be zoned as a conservation area. So there you cannot develop nothing, or can be not just an area, but also specific natural elements. So for example, tree protection or regulatory schemes in which that are usually applied in tree protection ordinances that say that whenever you want to do in that area, do what you want, but you cannot, let's say, remove the existing trees. They are all protected. And if you remove, you have some penalties, or you have to, let's say, replant in another space. Finally, the last regulation that, let's say, involve all the other instruments that can be more or less related to the zoning regulation of facilities are those based on zoning, and this is an example that especially in, say, North American municipalities, United States municipalities, is called cluster zoning. So we have an area to be developed. With this rule, let's say, I can cluster all the buildings in order to provide more open space preservation. So I cluster the building just in one side of my, let's say, the project area, and all the other have open space preservation. So this is to preserve more green space during, let's say, in new developments. Okay, so shifting to another type of regulatory instrument, but let's say a standalone typology that is design-based tools. So municipalities, when they draft the urban plans, can also, let's say, provide for some specific area that are for special interest, a more detailed action plan for that area. So right from the development of the urban plan, a municipality can say, okay, the general rule for all are this one, but for this specific area, I already, let's say, provide in my urban plan a specific detailed action plan. A master plan say that in this area, you have to put this green space, this blue space. So already, let's say, indicating the location typology of green-blue space to implement in the project area. So it's not just the rules, the general rules valid for all. So if you develop an area, you have to maintain, I don't know, 50% of the area permeable, but to say, okay, if you want to develop in this area, you have to maintain 50% permeable, but I show you also the location which this permeability must occur, and I show you also, and I say to you also how many trees you have to plant here. So a more specific, let's say, regulation with already the action that the municipality expect from the developers already stated in the master plan. Then we have the land acquisition programs instrument. So what means that the public administration can be a municipality, but can be also other regional authorities, for example, buys the land from private owners to prevent development or to realize public project of public interest. Of course, in our case, should be nature-based project. For example, this let's say this instruments is widely used in the UK to let's say to implement the green belt programs that in UK are quite widespread. So to create a green belt, let's say surrounding the city, in order to secure the services, the benefit provided by those green areas and reduce the pressures of climate impacts on the city, they buy the land from private owners so that that land cannot be developed, is preserved, is afforested by public project and so on. So to secure the land for, let's say, public benefits in order to reduce also climate change impacts at the world city level. Okay, so let's shift to the other typologies, so incentive-based instruments. Here you have a list of the first 4. Okay, we were saying incentives now, incentive-based instruments. So here you have a list of 4 typology of instruments that are all instruments that can be used to stimulate privates to voluntarily install nature-based solutions for adapting their buildings, such as with green roofs, or their open spaces, such as installing permeable pavement in their parking areas instead of asphalt, or installing some sustainable urban drainage systems, such as the ones that we saw before. These in exchange, so this action of installing nature-based solution in exchange of economic or other benefits. So of course, they are free to accept the incentives and do the action, or not to accept the incentives and do whatever they want. So don't do the nature-based installation. So these 4 are, so these, let's say, 4 economic or non-economic stimulations for privates involve, for example, the definition of preferential tax schemes. So if you install a nature-based solution in your private space, you have some tax reduction, some tax incentives, and so on. Or can be also a result of a subsidy program. So public administration, municipality put some money, then launch a call, whatever private want this money to install, to cover, for example, 50% of a green roof installation, you can take the money, install the green roof, and you have the direct subsidy to do the work. Then we can have also non-financial incentive, such as, for example, the density bonuses. So that means an increase of the building volume or the floor area that you are allowed to build by the general plan rule. But if you install also some nature-based solution, if you provide also green spaces along with your development, we can say that we can allow you to build 1 floor more, for example, or to build some more volume. So this is a non-financial, I mean, an indirect financial incentives, because then, of course, you build more and your building have more values. The last typology, also this one is non-financial incentives, is that if you include nature-based solution in your project, you obtain your development permits, let's say, faster than, let's say, what would be a traditional project. So let's say, a fast-tracking approval process for your development permits. Then we can have also incentive-based instrument based on the development rights. So we have the transfer of development rights program or the purchase of development rights. What means? For example, in the transfer of development rights means that we have a still undeveloped space, private space, but that was granted in the past with development rights. So the private can decide tomorrow to build something, to build a new home or to build an apartment. But the municipality says, okay, I don't want more that you build there because I found that this area is really a flood risk area. So we want that no more buildings happen there because it's in flood risk area. But we cannot say, okay, you cannot build and that's it. It's unfair. So those building rights are moved in another area. So we preserve those areas and we give you the opportunity to use your building rights in another area. In this case, let's say we reduced the potential risk in being flooded by moving away the development in another area. This is the transfer. Of course, there is also the purchase of development rights. So the same example that I said, a space in that can be developed by the private in a flood risk area, but the municipality or some other public administration decide, of course, you are not to build there. We don't allow you to build anywhere else, but we pay you we purchase your development rights. So we pay you to forgo, let's say, the land development rights. So compensation because you have not your development rights. The last incentive-based instrument is the so-called conservation easement. That is, let's say, legal agreement placed on a property to restrict the development, management, or the use of land. So it's a legal agreement between a public administration and the private, saying, okay, there, let's say, the property remains to you. You are the owner of that property, but you cannot do some activities. For example, you cannot harvest the trees, you cannot remove the trees, or you cannot use the land for some purposes. In cases, can be also, let's say, combined with monetary compensation. We can think about the case again of flooding. So there could be cases of easement to secure land for controlled flooding in natural, agricultural, private land. So we make this agreement with a private owner of the land, and we say, in case we need your land for controlled flooding, so to divert let's say, the river excess water in your land to save Faenza, let's say. In that case, according to our agreement, we can do this and we pay a compensation for you if you, I don't know, lose your agricultural cultivation that you were cultivating there. In US, there are a lot of cases of this, and they are called flowage easement. Okay, so last typology of information-based instruments. So last typology of, let's say, instruments that are the information-based instruments. Also here we found three. The first one is more targeted to the development of guidelines and criteria for public spaces, so for public space design and management. So in our case, to promote the integration and the management of public spaces with network-based solution. So, for example, the sustainable urban drainage system along the roads or in public plazas and so on. Then we have the other typology that is instead targeted to promoting good practices in private spaces. So it just, let's say, just providing or just accompanying, I don't know, the urban plans and urban policies with some guidelines saying, okay, if you are going to develop an area, should be good that you include also this. And we show you also that this has also economic returns. You reduce the risk of your area to being damaged by flooding, for example, and so on. So these are guidelines not only on the typology of network-based solution that can be included, but also, for example, on the maintenance aspect of network-based solution, the cost, and so on. So especially to raise awareness of the privates of what they can do in their area. The final example is for example, the granting of green certification schemes that are granted to certify that in your project or in your building, you have integrated green solution. There are plenty of these, let's say, certification schemes, global, such as BREEAM and other certification. They can also be developed and granted by the municipalities themselves. This, for example, happened in Rio de Janeiro, in which they have developed specific certification schemes. So if your project, if your buildings, let's say, achieve the objective of being carbon neutral or other objective related to nature-based solution, you are granted with a certification scheme. Of course, it's not legally binding, so you can decide if to work for having the certification scheme or not. But especially for developers, then when they build an apartment that have these certification schemes, in some cases it can be relevant for them also for the market, for the building market. So finally, we also try in this research through, let's say, a matrix that link different nature-based solutions and the different instruments that we found to see what typology of nature-based solution intervention based on the transformation allowed by the plan can be promoted by each of the review instruments. So by each of these 18, 19, I don't remember the total number, instruments. So for each typology of nature-based solution that you see in the left side of the matrix, such as typologies aimed at conserving green elements or typologies aimed at improving, let's say, the condition of existing development, so the existing built up areas, or integrating nature-based solution in new developments. So here we have a total of 8 categories. I'm not going into the detail here. Then I will show you that this is also a recent publication that you can access and see more in detail. So this one. So we try to see for each typology of nature-based solution intervention, our review instrument, which one seeks to, let's say, to promote. So we can say that not all nature-based solution intervention can be promoted by using all the instruments, but we also say here that each typology of nature-based solution always have more than one instrument that can be used, and this is important. So here I arrive to the final discussion point. This is important because we know now, we already know, some of us already know, but the important thing is that we provide the evidence that several alternative or complementary instruments are available to promote different typology of nature-based solution. Of course, in the context of climate change adaptation, these also depend on the target areas, if it's public or private. We have different instruments for different target areas. Then we also saw that especially or most of the regulatory instruments are particularly applied to leverage private resources for realizing and financing nature-based solutions across the city, for compensating, of course, their impact. But we also show that regulation especially works for new developments, while for, let's say, improving the condition of the existing areas, we must use incentives. So we cannot say to a private owner of an existing building, okay, from tomorrow we have a regulation that you have to install a green roof, even if you already built your house. No, it doesn't work like this. From tomorrow, the regulation works for the new development project. If me as a public administration want to I want also the existing areas to be, let's say, retrofitted with network solution, I can put, let's say, into the table some incentives and that can be used by private owners to be stimulated, to integrate network solution in their existing buildings or open spaces. Other important aspects that I want to touch is that, of course, we saw also from the matrix, combination of instruments are possible, but especially desirable in many cases in order to reach this wide scaling up application. Combination can be from the same categories, so both in two incentives based, such as transfer of development right and density bonus. So I give you the chance to build in another area, and I give you also a density bonus because we want really to preserve the original area. So you move away, and as a compensation of this, let's say, problem for you, maybe we give you also a density bonus. Or can be also different categories. So we can combine regulatory and incentive-based instruments, such as we mandate you to install a green roof, but at the same time, to thank you that you install the green roof, we also provide you with some tax incentives. Or this is very connected to the next point, that policy instrument mixes are key for effective scaling up, scaling out. But of course, it's not easy, no, because a selection of instruments to adopt case by case is, of course, based on local factors. So what is the public budget, for example, to provide incentives? Or if a municipality want to prefer command and control or voluntary instruments, and so on. Of course, these are instruments especially that target, let's say, private users, private developers in integrating network-based solution, but we also know that for realizing network-based solution in public spaces, there is no need to enforce this kind of instrument. So another, let's say, field on which to work is directly realizing the network-based project in public land, so infrastructure and buildings, public buildings, and so on. The last slide, the last discussion points that I want to highlight is that, for example, the maintenance aspect, that is another important aspect of network-based solution, is not extensively covered in the review instruments. Probably just in some guidelines, they mention also the maintenance aspects, just to share this information with the target user. But we found one case in which a regulatory instrument, so the Seattle Green Factor, so mainly this point system that you have to reach to achieve to have your development permits granted, also required a landscape management plan to ensure long-term management and functioning of the green spaces. So could work as a, let's say, as a best practice in this field, in the field of maintenance. Of course, another point of interest is that high attention should be paid on how a policy instrument is defined, no? Because it may be not sufficient to ensure high quality network-based solution. So for example, if I have a standard, say, prescribing just the share of green space to create or to maintain in an area, and this is something that sometimes happens also here in Italy, you can count as a green space to reach this objective just also the strip in the middle of a street to fulfill this requirement of, I mean, let's say, square meter of green space to include in your project. And of course, when we talk about network-based solution, we know that just a strip of grass in the middle of a street does not provide so much benefit. Instead of, I don't know, an urban park or sustainable urban drainage system and so on. So also pay attention on how you define your policy instrument, that they have to be defined, the requirements in order to target high quality network-based solution, or to try to target high quality network-based solution. Last, another important aspect that we found from the literature, from analyzing these cases, is that we could also have potential conflicts with other policy regulation. So also another important thing to do is to check and eventually amend or remove the other policy or other regulation that can prevent or the installation or the exact functioning of the network solution. Just an example that we found in a city or in a couple of city example, they mentioned that the building code, building regulation imposed the installation of curbs along all the streets. And this, of course, prevent the surface runoff to flow from roads into the vegetated area that are closed. So, for example, this is not good for reducing the runoff from street, reducing the flood risk. So that there are a lot of very, let's say, that seem small things to check, but they really have then a huge impact in the functioning of network solution. So I finished. I just put this question for you. Just maybe we will take this question in mind and we will discuss the last 10 minutes. So do you know if in your municipality or another one that you know already exists one or more of policy instruments such as the one that I presented here that are specifically applied to promote network solution? I leave you with this question. Think about it and maybe you discover that there still are some policy instruments in your city that work with this aim, or maybe you know that still there are, but they can be better tailored to reach this objective of promoting network solution. Okay, this is the recent publication on this research. So most of what I presented today, so it's open access. So I leave you also the title if you want to have more information on this. Thank you. And I don't know if you have a very quick question or if we should move to the next presentation. So clear. So thank you again. And now it's time for Linda. Okay, last check. Okay, I see. Okay. Yes, there is. I accepted. Yes, I accepted him. I have your. Okay, I share the screen. Okay. You have a problem with the screen? No? Yeah. Right now, it should work.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Linda Zagdo. It's a bit weird for me to be here. I feel very far from you, but I think I can't be standing there because of the logistics. I'll do my best not to be boring, as I think you already absorbed a lot of information. So we're going to have kind of 30 minutes presentation. The idea of this presentation is not to answer to sets of questions and providing you complex tools to do things, but it's more about highlighting opportunities that we can address through nature-based solutions, and ecosystem services in the spatial planning. So I hope we will end up with questions more than answers to stimulate also the curiosity about some possible things that we can do. Not too much or nothing. Okay, there it is. Okay, so what you're going to see in this kind of 30 minutes is about the relationship between ecosystem services and nature-based solutions, trade-offs, just a brief introduction about what trade-offs are, the role of planning, managing of trade-offs through planning, and then what this can, whether this can represent some bricks towards equity. It's slow. Okay. So what are ecosystem services? Ecosystem services can be described with plenty of definitions. The scientific literature, the great literature, they spent tons of lines of words for describing them. But making a long story short, we can say that there are all the goods and services that we can get from nature. So from ecosystems, from what we call green and blue infrastructures, for example. So just to try to jump from definitions to maybe something more visual, we can think about ecosystems, different ecosystems. You can see them on the right part of the slide. So we have woods and forests, mountains, the typical Mediterranean vegetation, savanna and fresh waters, sea, oceans, deserts. They all are ecosystems, and all of them, they provide ecosystem services. Just to give you a few examples, we can talk about mitigation of floods, reducing the heat in the cities when it's very hot in the summer, purifying air from pollution, but it's about providing things. So for example, wood for our stoves, if we still use chimneys or something like that. Renewables, for example, all the energy that we get from water through hydropower or solar PVs and so on. So everything that we get from nature, they can be defined as ecosystem services. Here you can see a more complex and complete representation of them. So actually they've been listed and categorized into 4 main families. We have mainly provisioning ecosystem services. So they mainly relate to goods that we receive from nature, something that we can touch, like even food, for example. Then we have cultural services. They're a bit harder to capture, let's say, but for example, if you go to visit the Alps, they represent an identity for the people living there. If you get rid of the mountains there, people living in that area, geographically especially, they would lose some idea of identity. Or some spaces are even sacred for some cultures, for example. We can think about woods, we can think about even the sea, from a touristic point of view, from a recreational point of view. So these are called cultural services. Then we have regulating services, which are the ones we benefit the most. Also, when we talk about climate change mitigation and adaptation. So when it is about regulating the climate, the global climate, regulating the temperature, regulating the water cycle and so on, those are all regulating services. And we end with supporting services, which are the invisible but necessary ones. So the nutrients in the soil, pollination, and so on. We do not directly benefit from them, but if they disappear, we're in troubles. So what are ecosystems? If ecosystem services are all the goods and services we derive from ecosystems, we can define ecosystems, let's say, in a broad sense, the natural capital. So it's about green and blue areas. It's not about public or private. When we deal with ecosystems as planners, for example, we're dealing with all the things that can provide ecosystem services. Why do they matter? Because they are fundamentals for human well-being. First of all, we can substitute some of them. For example, we can substitute the cooling effect of forests through the air conditioning, but it costs. And then there are some others, ecosystem services that we cannot just substitute. So if we don't have them, life is basically not possible. So we need to preserve this provisioning, and consequently, we need to preserve the ecosystems, healthy ecosystems, providing these ecosystem services. So you can see here in this scheme, in a very synthetic way, to which extent all these ecosystem services, they support the constituents of well-being, about security, basic material for good life, health, good and social relations, and how all these boxes, let's say, they create the basis for freedom of choice and actions, which are considered the fundamental elements for human well-being. So when going into something very concrete, when we are talking about ecosystems and ecosystem services, you can see in the scheme some examples. For example, if we're talking, you can see in the bottom part, we have urban woodland. This is an ecosystem. It provides habitat creation. You can see it on the top part of the thing. Then we have brownfield habitat roofs. So we can have, in terms of ecosystems, green corridors, we can have green roofs, we can have vegetable gardens in cities and so on. Sometimes it's not reinventing the wheel, we have them. It's just about seeing them and understanding really how they work and what we can do with them. Here I try to highlight what are the ecosystem services and what are the ecosystems. So the one in brownish are the ecosystem services. The one in green are the ecosystems providing the services. I did this because sometimes we kind of get them, but there is a lot of confusion about what is providing what. But basically, when we're talking about nature-based solutions, everything that we are doing is crafting, designing, restoring ecosystems to maximize the provisioning of the ecosystem services we need. For example, if we have urban heat island in a city, we're going to create a new park, for example, to lower down the temperature. That is a solution to a problem. The problem is urban heat islands. The nature-based solution is about creating the park. What we're doing is creating an ecosystem to provide ecosystem services. So if this is clear, this relationship of cause and effect is clear, then to make the thing a bit more complex, we have trade-offs. So we said that all ecosystems provide ecosystem services, which is true. But then I really got what a trade-off is when, during my PhD, I moved to the Netherlands for a while to study there in a research center in Wageningen. And I remember those days I was living with Dutch housemates. I was the only Italian person in the house. And I really remember one of my mates that the first morning prepared, before going to the university, he prepared a peanut butter sandwich for lunch and for breaks. So 4 sandwiches, 1 for the morning break, 2 for the lunch, and another 1 for the afternoon break. Second day, other 4 peanut butter sandwiches. Third day, again and again. And the end of the week, I could not prevent to ask him, like, why are you not changing sometime? First of all, you might like eating something different. It's not even that healthy. And he said, yeah, but it's easy to prepare, it's cheap, and it fills my stomach, so it's enough. And this is usually how we behave with green areas. We think that green is green, like food is food, and we forget that within green, we have different things. It's like in food, we have proteins, we have vitamins, we have fibers. It's not that a sandwich is providing everything, a peanut butter sandwich. The same is with parks and urban green areas. If we don't zoom, understand what we're putting there, are we putting trees? Are we putting grass and so on? We are really missing the power of what they can provide. So we need to do the same. So it is true that all ecosystems provide ecosystem services, but they do not provide the same ecosystem services and with the same level of effectiveness, okay? So for example, deserts, maybe they do not provide fresh waters, for example. They do not provide something, but they provide other things in a very powerful way and so on. Here you can see some examples. You can see in the columns different elements of ecosystems. So we have trees, we have bushes, we have grass, we have permeable soil, we have wetlands, fresh waters, fresh waters and soil. And then in the rows, we can see some ecosystem services, not all of them. So we have air purification, microclimate regulation, and you can see what is interesting from this table is that we can see that different elements can provide, I mean, if we are focusing on, one ecosystem service, it is provided by different elements, not only one, and the other way around. So if we're interested in maximizing one element, what is that element providing us? They are multi-purpose things. So here is the other reasoning, so same table, but focusing on one element, we can see that this element is providing us multiple ecosystem services. Here is the same scheme, but with quantification, because when we go to mayors, when we go to our policymakers and so on, it's important to provide them with numbers. Because if we just say, yeah, you know, ecosystems are good, they're good for life, without them, we cannot have quality of life. They say, yes, but I have a budget, I have time constraints, and maybe, for example, water plants for purifying water is better than trees. I don't know. And this is what happened in New York kind of 20 years ago. The city really faced a major issue with water. The Hudson River was known since centuries for the quality of water. And it was one of the main water sources in the city for tap water, which is kind of unusual for such a big city to have that quality of water. Then suddenly it got polluted. The authority in charge of water, first they freaked out. Then they got that they needed a plant for purifying water, but the costs of this plant and the management costs of the plant were going to really rise the taxes on the people, and was going to not be that affordable for many of them. Then, thanks God, the person that was in charge of the department for water control, he decided to try to understand what happened to the river, and then discovered that 200 kilometers north, forest was cut because of agricultural purposes, so land use change. And then they calculated how much square meters of forest were needed to go back to that quality of water. And the cost of retrofitting the forest was half of the cost of the plant. And they decided to go for that way. So they recreated the forest in the northern part. Of course, it was a long process, but nowadays they are back to high quality of water without spending the double budget for the plant. So if we can't quantify them, if we cannot give numbers to mayors, it's going just to be a good idea and it will not become a policy, basically. So what's the point with planning? We have ecosystems, but as we were saying, there are different ecosystems. They have different physical features. They can be, it's like people. I mean, a very tall person maybe is good for playing basket, but it's not good for riding horses. And it's the same with ecosystems. Based on their physical characteristics, they are good for something specific. And they are all good. It's not that a park is always better than a riverbank. We need to know what they are asking them. So based on what we choose, we have different ecosystem services provisioning. And this depends on the physical structure of the ecosystem itself. This is usually what we study. So based on the physical characteristics, what we can get out of that ecosystem, and we can quantify that. So what can the planning do? Let's say that we have ecosystems, which is the physical thing that we can deal with. We build nature-based solutions, guiding somehow the ecosystem service provisioning of the ecosystem. Here, I'm sorry, it's pixeled a bit, it's low resolution, this slide, sorry for that. But these are nature-based solutions that the European Union, for example, identified for climate change adaptation in cities. It's a long list of them. So what we can do is we can work with green urban infrastructures to maximize in city the provisioning of the ecosystem services that we need. If we know how ecosystem services work, we can map them, we can quantify them to see a picture of the city of how it is, or to design what we need that city to be, that neighborhood to be. We need more air cooling, we need more air purification, and so on. However, like a director in an orchestra needs to know the instruments to build something with sense, the planner needs to do the same with ecosystem. So you really need to know your instruments to play with them. And this is what urban planning can do. We can design the ecosystem that we need, and especially we can choose in space where we want them. Because if we put a park in a neighborhood or in another one, we are choosing where those benefits will be provided and who will be the beneficiaries of those benefits. So we will choose who is going to pay less in terms of air conditioning. We will choose who will have less respiratory problems. And are we choosing for wealthy neighborhoods or more vulnerable neighborhoods? So let's be a bit more specific about these trade-offs. As said, when we design a nature-based solution, when we design an intervention for the new creation or the restoration of an ecosystem for providing ecosystem services, we are also indirectly limiting the provisioning of other ecosystem services. For example, if in a park we decide to put a lot of trees, we are maximizing maybe air purification, we are maximizing microclimate regulation, but we are lowering the recreational power of that park, preventing people to play soccer there. We cannot have both. Or if we want a soccer field there, we cannot plant trees there. So we need to choose what is more important there. So we can create trade-offs. We can create the situation where to maximize something, we are losing something else. I wanted to show you this study. I mean, we're not going into detail about it, but in this matrix, at least you can gather a broad picture about, you can see in the lines, in the rows, different types of renewables. So there are all the ecosystem services being provided. So we have hydropower, we have solar PVs, we have biomass, agricultural biomass, wood biomass, and so on. And in the columns, you can see other ecosystem services that would be impacted, negatively impacted, if the renewables are produced. For example, if we decide that in that area we want to produce energy from solar PVs, and that is an agricultural area, so either we produce food or we produce solar PVs, energy through solar PVs. Or if that was a landscape with great value in terms of aesthetics, and people were going there because of tourism and so on, we need to choose if we want to preserve that landscape, or if it is more important to produce energy in that landscape. There are some things that do not go in conflict. For example, you can see in the white squares, where there is no conflict between the two ecosystem services. So there is synergy. You can have both of them. And in dark blue, where you have a trade-off. So if you maximize one of the two, the other one is getting worse. And there is no good and bad ecosystem services, just about the priorities for that specific area. So we decided to apply this trade-off analysis to a specific case in the Veneto region, in the northern part of Italy, for investigating the extent to which maximizing renewables in agricultural areas may affect the provisioning of other ecosystem services. In particular, we decided to analyze biomass, agricultural biomass from leftovers, so not dedicated crops, but only the leftovers from the crops for biomass, and the installation of solar farms on the ground. Just to see the extent to which, if the policies go towards one or the other, what would happen to the ecosystem services provisioning. So we identify, let's say, some suitability ranking where, non-suitability ranking. So where it is 0, there are no problems. If you see a 4, it's a high level of non-suitability. So we would not recommend that. We managed to, there are many indicators to link, let's say, the ecosystem services provisioning to ecosystems. A very easy and synthetic one for planners is a matrix introduced by Burkhardt and al., which is putting together land cover and ecosystem service provisioning. So we adopted this one, and we combine land covers with the provisioning of different ecosystem services. For both biomass and solar power, we identify then the trade-offs. So when you see here the 4, it means that if we want to produce their energy through solar PV, we are going to have a big trade-off in that specific land cover with that service that is also provided by that ecosystem. So basically, these are the set of maps for 5 different ecosystem services that came out if we would maximize biomass production for energy. So we see in the first part, in the first map, these are is agricultural production, and we see green. It means that if we increase the production of biomass, agricultural biomass from leftovers, we do not create conflict with food production, basically, or not high conflict with food production, because we're using the leftovers, we're not using dedicated crops. The second map is about water purification, and we see that in some areas, since they are very important for water purification, if we intensify the production because of biomass using fertilizers and so on, in the yellowish area, we might have some conflicts. It doesn't mean a red light. It means that policy need to take care of this and regulate the constraints and so on. And then we have the same thing for global climate regulation, the habitats, and cultural services. So if you have just a field with crops and then you're using the leftovers for biomass, you're not having a bad impact on the landscape, for example. So it's still okay. And this is the average of the 5 ecosystem services we identify. So where we have green, we can be relaxed. Let's say where we have the yellowish, be careful. The orange is where we need to be very careful. We did the same job with solar PV. So what would happen if we would maximize the installation of solar farms? This is the result. So we see a big conflict, the red with food production, green with water cycles, and green with global climate regulation, yellow with habitats, because a major presence of solar PV is changing a bit the microclimate. So it has an impact on the biodiversity of insects and animals there. And cultural services, where we have landscape with values. So for example, just think about the Prosecco areas, or where we have all those hilly areas where people go for some relaxing weekends and so on. If we cover them with solar PVs, there might be something would happen. And these are the average values. This is the comparison. So where we have suitability for both types of energy, you see the dark green, tiny spots. Where we have the green is about, it's fine for biomass, solar PVs being a bit careful. The orange is about, we need to be careful for both. And the red is about not suitability for, neither of them. So we thought that this could be relevant for decision makers, because nowadays our policies for suitability areas for renewables, they treat in the same way basically solar PVs and biomass in agricultural areas, apart from technical constraints, which is the slope. So if it is too steep, no solar PVs. But they do not consider the impacts on the ecosystem service provisioning. So we thought to highlight them where you might expect some negative impacts out of the and non-aware support of renewables development in those areas. So find hotspots for attention. This is the last block, just to conclude that, as we said, when we talk about nature-based solutions, so for example, in this case, we're talking about renewables production, which is a nature-based solution for climate mitigation. It's about preventing trade-offs, or at least to be aware about the fact that they may occur and map them and quantify them. But it's about how we distribute the benefits and the goods we're talking about. So I bring you a last example from the Trento province in the Dolomites. What we did here for the mayor's office was to map the provisioning of two services. So this is Trento. On the left, you can see the microclimate regulation provided by green areas in the city. And on the right part, the recreational services provided by the city. I will not dig into details about how we build these maps, not today because of time constraints. But what was useful was, you can see those small black areas in the right map. These are, for the master plan, they were potentially redevelopment areas. So the mayor office, the technical office could choose which one to restore, where to put the interventions. So what we did was, for each of them, so this is one, just a sample, we mapped the baseline of ecosystem service provisioning for the two services. So the two spots in the upper part, you can see the areas, the one with the dot line with the red dots, in terms of cooling and in terms of recreational power. And then we imagined to restore that area, in the first case, to maximize the cooling effect of the area, so to lower down the temperature of the neighborhood. And in the second case, to maximize the recreational power of that area. So having playgrounds, soccer fields, everything that the people in the neighborhood may want to spend nice afternoons and weekends. We then map the beneficiaries. So who may benefit the most from a cooler neighborhood and who may benefit the most from a more, let's say, entertaining neighborhood. We did this mapping based also on vulnerable groups, so where we have people with respiratory problems, elderly, kids, and so on. And so we built these 4 scenarios. So the one that you see, the 3 columns are 3 different scenarios. In the first case, if we want to have a balanced situation of the 2 ecosystem services, so each area is providing some cooling, but also some recreational areas. The second area is more about cooling. So we maximize the cooling effect of these areas. We imagine to restore them in a way that to cool down the neighborhoods, but no areas for playing, basically, or jogging. And the third one is more about pushing for parks where you can have some activities. And based on the people living in accessible areas, so walkable areas from the park, there we could see where we would maximize the beneficiaries. So for example, in the first case, you see that if your idea is to have a balanced area, so a balanced ecosystem service provisioning, where you reach the highest number of beneficiaries are the dark green areas in the middle part of the map. If your idea is to support elderlies with cleaner air and cooler temperatures in the summer, the ranking is kind of the same. On the other side, if you promote sports and playgrounds and areas for recreation, you see how the map changes. So you would restore the areas in the north because there is where you have the highest number of beneficiaries for that specific ecosystem services. You have a lot of families with kids that are from 5 years old to, let's say, 20 years old. So they are more resilient to maybe hot temperatures. They're not too young. And they would prefer recreation rather than having more a cooler neighborhood, let's say. So from a mayor point of view, this changes a lot because based on what they provide and based on what is your goal, you set different priorities. So where do you put your money? In which of these spots? So you can really guide, spatially define the provisioning of a service. And maybe you can also decide to promote to increase the resilience of vulnerable groups, to work in more vulnerable neighborhoods and so on. So I hope to shed some light on different aspects that you can address through a more specific analysis of the ecosystem services being provided by a nature-based solution. I thank you for the attention, and I would open the floor to questions, and thanks again. Yes. Yes, it is. It's an open access book. It is, the authors are Davide Geneletti, Bilal Adem Esmail, Chiara Cortinovis, and myself, Linda Zagdo. It's Planning for Ecosystem Services is the title.
It's an anecdote that's a little bit silly. Now, we plan and study and analyze, and eventually some politician decides that it's important to have a mall there.
Okay, so in that case, I mean, I think that the lucky situation with Trento, I mean, it was not only luck. 50% it was luck. And the other 50%, I think it was thanks to our supervisor who built through years some credibility with the municipality. So first of all, we just started sharing some results without pretending or without expecting them to become something real or specific. But then you meet once, you meet twice, and after a few, you start involving them in an Horizon project. And then through the years, you really build some trust with the offices there. And you can really start exchanging. And now I'm not working in Trento anymore. I used to, but I know that the team there is now, they shall be involved in the new green plan for the city, because they got that green areas are not just about aesthetics. It's really about providing benefits to the people. So it took a long time. It's not just about one shot, but something changed. And also the people there were open. I mean, you need to be a bit lucky and you need time and to be very patient.
Yes. Well, if I could just add, we all know what SECAPs are for the municipality sustainable energy and climate adaptation plan. And it's similar what you say, we in Croatia now started what is called study of urban green renewal. That's the name of the document, or green plan, which is an upgrade of the second. And the municipality, luckily for us there, if you want EU funding for any green projects, you will have to have those documents now. So maybe a little bit of work for us.
Became binding, yeah.
Questions?
Or even reflections. I mean,
Any answer to my previous question?
Which one, 6 months enough from yesterday or that one or?
No.
Yeah.
So the answer is no, probably. Or I don't know.
Well, the answer to that question is always the same, especially the first 6 months of the project.
in the chat.
Okay.
Good point.
Oh, there are no if there are questions from the online users, or if not, we can. Okay, so basically, say to summarize in 2 minutes our path, our transnational seminar activities. No, so we started with understanding, studying more in detail the impact that climate has on cities, how we can adapt cities. So the first seminar, we focused especially on heat stress and urban time effect, how the design of the city can affect this. The second one, we focus more on flood risk and resilience, different types of flooding that can happen, how cities can be managed to reduce the risk, how is the contribution to the solution, especially now we jump more in the planning perspective, maybe in the broad terms of what instrument can be used, but also what kind of the decision on trade-off or on maximizing something, or not only maximizing ecosystem services at the expense of another, but also maximizing some beneficiaries of the services than others. And these are all decisions that must be taken, especially because I mean, we are all aware that we are in time of very strong competition for land uses, but also very low budget resources. So we need to prioritize some action than the others. And this it was also a good point touched by Eva.